Good afternoon, my name is Zabel Yessayan, and today we are honored to give a special tribute to our prominent writer, author, activist Zabel Yessayan. Today's event is co-sponsored with several organizations: the Ararat-Eskijian Museum, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, Armenian International Women's Association Boston, and Armenian International Women's Association, acronym Iowa, Los Angeles affiliate. All the three organizations have common objectives. The AEM is established for the preservation of Armenian rich culture and through the museum exhibits and monthly lectures. National organization is one of the oldest and prominent institutions independently based in Belmont, Massachusetts, and has remained one of the leading organizations in promoting Armenian book publications, promoting young and upcoming scholars, organizing conferences and various universities. I'm very grateful to the Master Treaty representatives who are here today, because through their efforts I'm able to promote educational events in here, and I'm very thankful to their headquarters in Boston, Massachusetts. Our organization, based in Massachusetts, initially was established in 1991. I have to give homage to those three ladies who started the Iowa organization, because they gave voice to the voiceless. And as we can see today, is homage that we're giving to Zabel is a proof of their hard work the last 10, 11 years. The founders have saw the need for an Armenian organization that would unite Armenian women worldwide and focus on the issues of mutual interest and concerns on economic and social and personal advancement. Since their establishment, the organization has grown internationally and have major events annually worldwide. And they do have I believe, a very, I'm sure Zabel will announce it, a very a good program coming up in the next few weeks. Today's program is as follows: opening remarks by Professor Rubina Pirunia. Dr. Pirunia is a leading scholar of Armenian literature and has published 4 publications and numerous articles. She will give a brief overview on Zabel Yessayan. Following her introduction, we will screen the documentary. We have shortened from original, which was 45 minutes to 25 minutes, so that we can give time to our editors to have a conversation and for you guys to have question and answer period. Following that, we will invite Zabel Yessayan, our Los Angeles affiliate president, an activist herself, a great community leader, with Zabel Yessayan, the editor, and as well as our guest who is here today, Mrs. Deukmejian Grand, the editors. Thank you. I have to tell you, when I was a young student, I was a literature, I'm a history person. But when I took it, I didn't understand it. But thanks to your new books now, it made more sense to me, especially in my early 60s. I see the bigger picture. So this is a Herculean work, and it takes a lot of guts to do what you guys did. So thank you very much, Ira and the ladies who worked so hard on this. Afterwards, they will have the conversation. We'll have a quick Q&A period. And then there will also be books available by Arnold for those of you who would like to purchase. The authors will be signing it. And then we'll go across the courtyard for a nice, beautiful exhibition and a reception. I couldn't have done this if it wasn't for 2 individuals. Deukmejian, who's sitting right here, was interrupted my introduction, who came from Paris, France. He's working a project for the museum. It was his efforts that I was able to get all those pictures that are in the exhibit today, as well as having them enlarged in France, because they were this high, the pictures, and he had to make them larger, and all the letters that he was able to accumulate from different archival places. So thank you. Thank you, Judith, for sending me the documentary, and to Haraj Deukmejian. Without him, Haraj, you are a lifesaver in our community. You gave a little bit of warmness and a little bit of Armenian flair with the Armenian rugs, so that we can put Zabel to where she needs to be. So also, if you'd like to be on those other side, if you'd like to be on our email list, or any of the organization, so we'll be informing you of upcoming events. You can put down you want to be on Iowa list, or NASA list, or Ararat-Eskijian, and we'll pass it to them. And we do have upcoming events, so please help yourself. Just a small note that Dr. Pirunia will be giving a talk on May the 11th at the Abriel bookstore on her 4th publication, so there are announcements available. If I missed anything, thank you all for coming today. I know there's several dynamic programs today, but you chose to come here, and I'm very grateful that you are here. With no further ado, Dr. Pirunia, this is your floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie, for this important introduction. Thank you for inviting me to say a few words to open this wonderful event. Let me start by reading an excerpt from Zabel Yessayan's Inner Rooms, or Amid the Rooms, as I had translated it years ago for my first book on Armenian genocide literature. It was published in 1993, and in this book I have a chapter on Zabel Yessayan. So I'm reading from this book. In a few years, the orchards will bear fruit again. The fields...
A microphone. Into the mic.
Oh. In a few years, the orchards...
Right, talk into the mic.
Yes, into my mouth. I don't know what to do with it. In a few years, the orchards will bear fruit again. The fields will be covered with the golden grain of copious crops, and the children's cries will once again fill the empty houses. The tortured but invincible race will persevere despite all murderous intentions. This is what Zabel Yessayan saw hovering over the ruins of Cilicia, reflected in the ghostly appearances of widows and glittered in the eyes of orphans. This is what our nation is. How many times the enemy's hatchets, swords, guns, and fire, and more relevant to the recent Azeri assaults and aggression, heavy artillery, tanks, and drones have brought death and destruction on our people, and we have survived. We have persevered. Zabel Yessayan believed in that incredible capacity, and she called it our national characteristic. Her response to the Cilician catastrophe and her later works embody her fight for justice in her own way. She made every effort to portray the collective suffering of our people, to textualize the national tragedy, and to give meaning to an inexplicable atrocity. She highlighted survival and perseverance. Born in 1878 in Scutari, Constantinople, Zabel Yessayan was known as an accomplished writer of free verse and short stories when she was only in her 20s. She was able to, and I'm reading again from here, she was able to mold feelings of love, hope, lust, envy, jealousy, and frustration into artistic and lyrical expression. She was capable of opening the darkest corners of the human psyche. A sensitive and keen observer who knew her environment well, she created for her characters settings which vividly and realistically reflected life in Constantinople with all its social, political, and economic deprivations and injustice under Ottoman rule. She stressed particularly the underprivileged status of women in Armenian society and was known as an outspoken feminist. I really truly want to congratulate Yessayan's translators, editors, and IWA for this very important initiative and their endeavor, remarkable endeavor, to bring to the fore and introduce to the English-speaking world Zabel Yessayan, the extraordinary woman, the writer, the feminist, the fighter, the victim of her own unwavering convictions, her love for Armenia and Armenians. This love took her to Armenia in 1993, after residing in Paris for a few years after the genocide. She led a very busy and productive life, teaching, writing, and lecturing. What happened to her? The last years of her life in Armenia is a mystery. After a long silence from 1937 to 1960s, Soviet sources merely mentioned 1943 as the date of her death, a victim of Stalinist purges. Who knows? Dying in an unknown place, buried in an unmarked grave, far away, is somewhere unknown in Siberia. 30 years ago, when I was writing, that was in 1985, when I was writing my dissertation at UCLA, I had to translate every literary piece that I needed to quote. There was none available. Of course, in contrast with the Holocaust literature, the plethora of Holocaust literature in their original English or French originals and or translated into these languages. I had no difficulty to select and use the most poignant pieces of Holocaust literature for my comparative study. Today, I'm thrilled and so gratified to see the current urge, especially among young scholars and artists and filmmakers who have mastered the world languages, and they unearth our literary treasures and represent them to the world in a more accessible medium or language. This is in itself one way that we really fight for high thought. Indeed, this is a way, a struggle in high thought for our cause, showing the world, and especially to the generations in Turkey, the new generation, the culture and the life of Armenians before the genocide, the horrors of genocide and its aftermath. Today, we will have the opportunity to relive the historical moment in which Zabel Yessayan carved her individuality and left a rich legacy. And to end my thoughts here, I want to emphasize one more matter, which is an echo of her works, especially in the rooms, which is most relevant to today's, the present Armenian situation. We are witnessing history repeating itself. The players are the same. Their character, their behavior follows the same pattern. In the words of Zabel Yessayan herself, one is civilized, builds and creates. The other nurtures bloody aspirations and destroys. Thank you.
Well, hello, I am Deukmejian, and I am here with two of the co-authors of the last translation by the Armenian International Women's Association of Zabel Yessayan's work, and this one is In the Ruins, which Dr. Perumian said you translated it as Among the Ruins, but both will have the same effect in the end. I'd like to start, the documentary was very well put together, by the way. Very well put together from a 45-minute documentary to bring it down to 25 minutes and give the essence of Zabel Yessayan, which was covered most of the topics that we probably will be hearing about today. But I think that today, when Danila and Judith Sarian speak, you will find that there's more of a personal connection because they have worked so hard on the book. Before I go further, I want to introduce both Judith Sarian and Danila Deukmejian, both co-authors and co-editors, pardon me, thank you, co-editors. And the most important thing I think I'd like you to know about them is that Danila is a librarian who has let me read just a tiny bit about her. She is a graduate of l'Institut des Études Sociales de l'État from Belgium. She's specialized in library science documentation. She has attended the École des Lettres in Beirut, and she has a master's in library science from Simmons University in Boston, and has done a great deal of consulting and research work. And now she has been working with AWA. Both Judith and she have been working with AWA and to showcase the works of the newly translated Ottoman Armenian author Zabel Yessayan. Now, Judith Sarian is a graduate of Wellesley College in Massachusetts, but her degree is in economics. She had a successful career as a financial consultant or portfolio manager, was vice president of a financial institute, and she has been referred to very often by, or asked for some consulting through CNN and CNBC, as well as the Herald Tribune, Wall Street Journal, on financial commentaries. And after such a successful career, she decided to join in this research work and do the help with the editing and translations. And I want to ask about why before we move on into the subject. Now, I know that you're a librarian. It's your profession, your passion. But how did you happen to get so involved, Judith? And then we'll go into Zabel Yessayan.
Thank you very much, Silva, for that very nice introduction. And thank you all for coming today. I'll try to make this a short answer. I can go on for a very long time about when people ask me questions, as those of you who know me recognize, but I'll try to keep this short. I always loved to read books, and as a teenager, I had my nose in books all the time, and so literature just was my favorite hobby. Secondly, I have obviously, like many of you, I remember or know about my grandmothers, both of whom were from the old country, from Western Armenia, and I knew one of them very well. She lived with us, but the other one I never really met, and she was a survivor of the genocide. And we, when I knew that her story was a very tragic one, she lived most of her life in Raqqa, Syria, which now we know of as the capital of the Islamic Caliphate. But what I know of her really was from a variety of sources, never firsthand. And when I read Zabel Yessayan, I felt that she was giving voice to these Armenian women, particularly in the book, In the Ruins, that we most recently translated. She was the conduit for the voices of Armenian women and children who were survivors of the massacres of Adana, and then she went on to be taking down eyewitness testimony from survivors of the genocide. So she really was the one who was doing this immediately, after the events. I mean, within months after the events. Her book, okay, so I am going on. So that, I would say, is probably the most important reason. I felt like these women never were really never had a chance to tell their stories, and Yessayan did that for them.
Thank you, Judy. And I want to ask Danila as well, because your passion is literature, and you have also studied a lot of foreign literature. Now, how did you become so involved with the women of the Ottoman, the women writers of the Ottoman Empire?
It happened, I think, very organically, incidentally. When I retired from the university in 2012, I was very happy to be retired, but I loved doing research, and when a group of women proposed to read Yessayan's Gardens at the time, I said, yes, why don't we do that? So it started with a book club and a reading, and then when Judy got very enthusiastic about it, and I was influenced by
As Judy always does.
As Judy always does, and she said, why don't we translate this? And I was all for it because I enjoyed research, I enjoyed that book a lot. I was fascinated by this woman, and she's formidable. There's no one to that.
She definitely is. She definitely is, and at the forefront of her time. In fact, quite contemporary, even for today's. Now, I want to go back to the book. It did say in the documentary that she went to Adana on a mission after the massacres of 1909. Talk to me a little bit about that, then. How and why would she be sent out to Adana?
Yessayan was asked by the Patriarchate of Constantinople to go to Adana, and this was extremely unusual. Most of the people who had been sent to Adana or had been asked to go were members of the Red Cross. They were medical people. There were also some religious people, but it was very unusual to send a woman who did not have medical training, and she was sent with a mission to provide relief for the widows and orphans. And I believe the reason she was sent is that she was very well known in the community. She had been writing and publishing for years in the Constantinople papers. She was an editor of women's pages. She wrote a lot about the education of children. But even more important than that, I mean, the fact that she was a writer, and she was a fearless writer. She criticized many of her peers. She had written a satire about one of her peers that was called Phony Geniuses, and it created a furor in the community. But the patriarch and the patriarchate must have understood that a woman who could do this could face up to the incredible difficulties that that she would have to deal with in Adana. And in fact, it was a very dangerous journey that she took to Adana, not just the physical journey, but actually being there, dealing with the orphans, trying to provide for them, and having to work with missionaries, going into the prisons, and working directly with the Armenian prisoners. There was incredible fear in the community because many innocent Armenians had been hung, and she had to go and deal with the Young Turk leadership, Cemal Pasha. This was not for the faint of heart, and I have to give credit to the patriarchate. They must have understood that.
Yes. Obviously, to send a woman out there, specifically at that time of our history, was a dangerous task, but a very brave task as well. I, unlike Maggie, usually like to read novels, and I like poetry. I don't usually read much history, but In the Ruins did grab me. It grabbed me because my grandmother is from Adana, or was from Adana, and she used to talk about, say, the Chat, and then she also talked about the fire, the Izmir fire. Now, in the book, In the Ruins, Zabel has very visceral descriptions, extremely vivid, very hard to read, and that is probably why I don't really read much of the history books that depict a lot of the true suffering. It's too emotionally, it's too emotional for me. But it is something we have to face. Now, I want to ask Danila, when you read the book with all those descriptions, how hard was it for you to overcome the emotional part of it and then put yourself away from it to be able to translate, to help with the editing of it? I mean, what part could you take out? What part could you put in? How you could actually put it together? If you could give me a bit of that.
I started when I read the book, because we were having it translated and edited. For the very difficult parts to me, it was very difficult. But at the same time, I just couldn't put the book down. I just couldn't. Because of the way, whenever I read her, especially in Armenian, for me, I can hear her voice in every single word. And that is very powerful in that book, and in all her books actually. But because of the subject of In the Ruins, I think it was, in a way, it was very difficult to read her book, and in a way, it was very easy because you can't get away from it. And as far as editing is concerned, it was a teamwork with Judy, with Joy, and myself, and we didn't. This is the work of the translator. We had a translator we were dealing with, and we didn't cut.
There was no hesitation.
No. There were absolutely not. It was just a matter of how close is it to the Armenian, right, Judy? I personally, when we translate works from Armenian to other languages, to English, I'm particularly interested in the colloquial Armenian. I want the colloquial Armenian to be untouched. Those expressions in Armenian, and in some translations, they are translated into English or into French, and I just don't do well with that.
Judy, then I want to just add to this then, with such descriptions, do you think it was a deliberate deliberate on her part to use those descriptions, because I mean the book was published, what, 2 years after the actual massacres? Who was it intended for, and who was it published by in that case?
I believe Zabel was extremely deliberate in everything she wrote in this book, in The Ruins. I believe it was a highly political book. Yessayan herself said later on in life, literature is not a pretty ornament, a flower, or a pleasant pastime. Literature is a weapon to struggle against injustice. And I do believe she wrote this book as a struggle against injustice. The book was written in Armenian, and it was intended primarily for an Armenian audience, but read the preface. The preface is very illuminating. In it, she addresses her book to the entire Ottoman fatherland. And it's clear that she is struggling to write this book for the benefit of everyone, all the new citizens. As of 1908, there was the restoration of the Constitution, so minorities in the Ottoman Empire, as well as the Muslims, the Turks, were all citizens according to this. And she was writing this book for everyone, asking these new citizens to look at their country and look at it in its true colors, to see what is happening, and not to allow it, not to allow the Armenians who had fought for this these progressive movements, who had fought for human rights side by side with the Young Turks in 1908, not to allow these people to be punished over and over again for the fact that they had done this. They had been sacrificed in this struggle, and she spelled that out very clearly in her introduction. And she said that if the fatherland does not look at what's happening in this country, then tyranny will return over and over again.
And we see, oh, is this mine? It is on, it is on, it is on. And we see that tyranny even today in with the, let's say, the war in Artsakh, Azerbaijan. You see it, there's a repetition of what she actually claimed to be that observant and understanding of the tyranny that was to come.
Yes, she was very prescient, and this is something that that I realized when I was reading her preface. Tyranny, unfortunately, did return, and as we know, Turkey really has never owned up to its history, never saw the bleeding country in its true colors, and in fact, we're seeing some things that are very closely parallel to what happened to the Armenians in Adana and in the genocide, specifically in Diyarbakir with the Kurds. The Turkish government has been bombing civilians in Diyarbakir, in areas that historically were Armenian as well as Kurdish. And there are many people there who believe that they're specifically doing this, and as a matter of fact, expropriating property from the local Kurds and the Armenians, the newly renovated Sut Giragos Church in Diyarbakir. They've expropriated this, the government, saying that they're going to renovate it, but a lot of people believe that what they're going to do is put refugees there, Syrian refugees, into these lands. Now, we don't know if that's true, but that certainly is a fear. This is one of the reasons that these massacres in Adana occurred in the first place, and Yessayan refers to it. And I was talking earlier about this. There were Cretan Muslims from Crete, who had recently been refugees after Crete became part of Greece. They had been forced to leave. They had been specifically resettled in Adana in order to reduce the Christian population. This was a government policy over and over again in Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire and afterwards, reduce the Christian population, and these Muslim Cretes were among the fiercest attackers of the Armenian population in Adana. So this, she talks about these particular communities which fell upon the Armenians. So we're seeing a clear repetition, and this is happening all over, but particularly in these areas in the Middle East. which are in war.
Danila said that there was something else that she observed in the preface. So
In addition to the preface and the introduction, where the tone is different, like Jude mentioned, I find the letter she wrote to her husband at the end of the book, In the Ruins, very, very interesting. And that follows the same style. She tells the truth in the book, even though it's considered as a fiction book or close to a fiction book. But in her letters to her husband, she speaks differently, and she says things that are very interesting. I found those letters as interesting as the book, as a matter of fact.
thank you. And since we're on the subject of letters, I do know that she communicated, and we heard that she sent letters from when she was in Yerevan. And it was pointed out that even when she wrote to her husband, there was always a paragraph for her daughter Sophie. And we got a little glimpse of it today, so maybe you can talk about that, and I do want to come back to another subject with you.
Yes, she, almost in every single letter, she would ask about Sophie. And I also read letters, for some reason, they used to communicate in French. Sophie used to write to her in French, she used to answer in French, and she was very, very fond of her, and I think she missed her a lot when she was in, especially that she was in a very difficult situation.
All right, now I'm going to move on to ask you a little bit about her childhood or her youth, her schooling, the kind of woman that made her become that fearless woman of that century. If you could give me a bit more about her.
She was certainly extremely unusual, and I think we have to give a lot of credit to her father. She learned how to read from her father at a very young age, before the age of 4, and as she grew up, she spent many hours with him discussing really important issues. I mean, he would bring these issues up, but he clearly could see that she was very interested in issues of what was right, what was fair, what was just. And he had very strong convictions about human rights and human dignity. He also had strong opinions about women's emancipation, and he expressed hopes that she would follow in that path and write about women's issues. And she certainly did write about women's issues, but she didn't call herself a feminist. She also did go to school. She was somewhat of a rebellious child, so in school she always got into trouble. She went to formal schooling for 4 years, graduated from Surkach School when she was 14 years old, and apparently the principal and the teachers complained quite a bit about her. She would play pranks, and oftentimes these were because she would be so incensed by the behavior of some of the other children who were from upper class, who were well off, and they would mistreat the poor children in the school. And this would just, she would react bodily to these kinds of injustice. So it was clear that she was just, she was driven and very focused on human rights, and this just became more and more evident as she grew older and as she experienced, the experience of living outside the country, of living in Paris, of coming back to Constantinople, and basically becoming a refugee. And this is something that we could talk quite a bit about.
I'm jumping from one part of her life to the other so that we can get a fair idea of the woman that she was and what she represented. I'm going to ask you this time about the book itself, In the Ruins, has been acclaimed by most as one of her best works. Havok Boshagan, in volume 6 of his, The Panorama of Western Armenian Literature, said that, is this going and coming? That he wrote, on pages that will live forever, our national sensibility is condensed with an intensity, a humanity, and an authenticity that is unrivaled in our ancient or modern literature. Now, since you have both worked on her different works, different books, I'm going to ask, how does this work of Yessayan's differ from the other writings, Garden of Silitar and or My Soul in Exile, which were both written at a later time of her life?
I'll start to do it, then you can add on something that I may not comment on. Well, yes, so this is, all three of these works were written in a very strong first-person voice. And I think that's something that connects her best works, that they were written in this passionate first-person voice. And it works brilliantly in these works. In the book In the Ruins, which is basically a testimonial account of the aftermath of the genocide, she is using her voice as witness. But she also interviews many of the survivors, and she allows them to speak in this book. So you'll find long passages from other people, from the people who were there during the actual events, describing what happened to them. And I think this is a very unusual and fascinating part of the book, and different from her novel, her novels, several novels that she wrote, and it's different from her memoir of her childhood. So the same can be said for My Soul in Exile, again, passionate first person, that was published 10 years later, 11 years later, 1922. In the Ruins was 1911. And then her book, The Gardens of Silitar, was not published until 1935. She actually wrote it while living and working as a professor in Armenia, in Soviet Armenia. But again, you have this voice, this strong, passionate voice describing her childhood. What's very different is, of course, this voice is actually a voice of a young girl. And she's managed at the age of 53, 54, to capture that, that immediacy, that childlike amazement of the world. She was a very observant child, and she captures that so that when you read it, it's hard to believe that she wrote it so late in life. So clearly, this was the voice of the child. My Soul in Exile was the voice of the artist. It's a novel, but there are autobiographical elements. It's the voice of the artist, which she would use again and again as a writer of novels. And then In the Ruins is the voice of a witness, someone bearing witness. So, it's really wonderful because you can see the many facets of Zabel Yessayan in these three works.
Thank you, Judy. Now, Danila, did you see a difference in, the style is different, definitely, but you said that in the Ruins you heard that voice of hers, that southern note.
Her voice is everywhere.
It is.
And I can summarize it by two words. One is passion. Mm-hmm. She's an extremely passionate woman, very intelligent and gifted. As if, as if she was meant to do this. As if she was born to do this.
It's what we all aspire to be. In the documentary, she is also a member of AWA, and she works very closely with AWA. So it was good to see her in there, to see just how much she realized when she went through the Dusaps and Sibyl and some of the other writers of the time, Siran Cesar as well. They actually did give a voice to the woman, but for some reason there's something about Yessayan's, I believe it must be that courage that she has.
She's fearless. She's fearless. And Judy also, and speaking of how brilliant she was, Judy also was talking about her childhood when in her teenage years. And there was literary salons, just like in the 18th century France in Istanbul, when she was growing up. And in her autobiography, at the age of 14, she was invited to one of to go and attend consistently those, and apparently she was terrified. She was very interested, and all the big names, I can't remember it right now. And she was there listening, absorbing everything, not participating because she was a child. But so this is also just to tell you what people thought about her at the time.
She lived in Soviet Armenia. She went there without her family. Why did she leave her family behind? I mean, why did she go to Soviet Armenia, and what were her thoughts of motherland? She liked it there, but she also had some tough days there. Am I correct?
Well, that's, yes, very true. She first visited Soviet Armenia in, it was 1927. She was invited to go, and she had a very favorable impression. And then she worked as an editor of a Soviet journal in France. She had moved away from Paris. She really didn't feel a part of the Paris diaspora community, and she went a little bit outside of Paris, Viroflay, which is I don't know, several miles away. But she was invited to come and work there as a professor at the Yerevan State University in the 1930s, 1932, I believe. So when her husband had already died. He died in 1922 of tuberculosis. So she was living with her daughter and son in Paris. So I think she took one of them with her when she went to Soviet Armenia in 1933, and then the other, I think her son may have joined her afterwards. So they did come to live with her, and from all accounts, they were quite happy together. But she knew that she was creating waves. In particular, when she spoke so strongly in favor of Chavez. She participated at the literary conference in Moscow, I think in 1934. So she knew that she was being watched, and she must have understood that feeling very well, because exactly the same thing had happened to her in Constantinople from, early on until 1915 when she escaped. So, she knew, in Constantinople that there were Armenian traders who were reporting on the writers to the government in Constantinople. She knew that, and she must have known that in Armenia, in Soviet Armenia as well. And they were Armenians who were reporting on what the writers were writing about. So whether it was her support for Chavez, whether it was the fact that she had one time been sympathetic to Dashnak, whatever it was, she had a sense that she was being watched, and but nonetheless, she was able to write one of her most beautiful works there, The Gardens of Silidar.
Yes. She was in prison for quite a while, wasn't she? Before they lost trace of her. There's a discrepancy. It says 1943, and then or in the 50s is when she passed away. But there,
no, she was imprisoned in 1937. I think it's the same year as Chavez and others. And she, the last letter, they thought that there was, he mentioned, Deukmejian Yessayan mentioned that they had a letter dated 1946, but everyone else seems to believe that the last letter from the Baku prison was 1942, and the official government report that they eventually got, the family got many years later, said that she died in 1943 on the way to Siberia, I believe. People think that she had been in prison in local prisons until 1942, and then at some point they decided they were going to transfer her to Siberia, and that she was killed or died on the way. So she was rehabilitated, it sounds like, based on the film in 1957.
okay.
So, yeah.
I think that's where the confusion came in.
Yeah.
We don't know exactly how she, nobody knows exactly how she did.
She's a fascinating woman, and I think we can keep talking and talking about her because there's so much depth in just her life, not just in her writing, but her own life. But what I do want to do is to give a taste of the style of her writing. Danila, can you read something apart, a section? You so beautifully in Armenian, the way, as she wrote it, and then I'd like Judith to also give a sample of the translated one of your favorite pieces in, because I do want to leave some time for maybe question and answers before we go into the exhibition that's so beautifully prepared.
You want to do it as usual, or?
Shall I start first? We were hoping to be the same
Yeah.
piece,
Yeah.
because that way, just one, would you rather us do just
Okay,
one?
which would we?
Should we do, well,
Let's do the rooms.
in the ruins? Okay, we'll do the chapter 2 from In the Ruins, which is also called In the Ruins. And I'll just read some sections of it. Under a superb, dazzling sun, the devastated city stretches outward like a cemetery without end. Ruins everywhere. Nothing has been spared. All the churches, schools, and dwellings have been reduced to formless piles of charred stone, among which, here and there, the skeletons of buildings jut up. From east to west, from north to south, all the way to the distant limits of the Turkish quarters, an implacable, ferocious hatred has burned and destroyed everything. Over this deathly wasteland and these immense piles of ash, 2 minarets, unscathed, rise arrogantly toward the sky. Draped in rags, stained with blood and tears, a crowd of widows, orphans, and old people presents itself to us. This is all that is left of Adana''s Armenian population. The crowd has the sullen calm of a sea that has fallen still after a big storm. Its pain and inconsolable sorrow are hidden in its depths and rise only fitfully to the surface. The hope of living, of being reborn, has been snuffed out in these people. And if hunger and thirst had not shaken them out of their stupor, life would already have been extinguished in them for good. Indeed, it is impossible to grasp or feel the atrocious reality all at once. It exceeds the limits of the human imagination. Even those who experience that reality cannot give an account of it as a whole. They all stammer, sigh, weep, and recount only disconnected events. Despair and terror had reached such heights that mothers failed to recognize their children, and crippled or blind old people were forgotten in houses that had been set ablaze. Listening to a savage, bloodthirsty mob's diabolical, raucous laughter, people lost their minds before dying. Mangled limbs and children's bodies, still throbbing with life and pain, were trampled underfoot. Trapped between rifle fire on the one hand and flames on the other, women, children, and the wounded who had taken refuge in churches and schools wrapped their arms around each other as, crazy with fear, they were burned black. It is in people's anxious, terror-stricken eyes that sometimes, for a moment, I think I can catch a glimpse of it. Oh, those eyes. Some appear to have been struck blind and to have renounced the joys of the sun forever. They seem as empty as bottomless chasms. Some look at you without seeing, because one image has been indelibly impressed on their field of vision. Some have preserved the rhythm of the ghastly flames in their gaze, and some, with pupils in constant motion, pupils tormented by haunting scenes of the fire and bloodshed, seem to long for blindness and peace. In this nameless catastrophe, it is not the charred houses or devastated gardens that seem past saving and past reclaiming, nor is it the large numbers of the dead and dying. Rather, it is that crippling inner feeling drifting through everyone's eyes, a feeling of misery, of despondency. It is the feeling of a people that has been trodden underfoot, that has been crushed under the souls of brutes. Heads that, thirsting for light and freedom, had for a moment been lifted in human dignity, have been smashed with ruthless cruelty. Tortured by this thought, I look out at the demolished city, whose hope heaps of charred rubble take on a different and terrible meaning. And yet, amid this sinister desolation and despair, a smile of hope looms. In the ruins, a group of women has taken refuge in the shade of the partly demolished walls. Suspended between one wall and another, a cradle is gently rocking. Who knows? What the violence of our grief presents as impossible is perhaps possible after all for the people's untiring, unconscious genius for rebirth. For that wretched child's humble cradle, indifferent to the immense general calamity and quick with an invincible instinct for life, is rocking above this vast cemetery, perfectly indifferent to both the martyred people's abject misery and the criminal's monstrous savagery.
Աբերակներու մեջ երկրորդ գրող։ Վեհանցն ու շլացուցիչ արևին տակ կդարածվի կանթված քաղաքը անձայրացի քերեզմանու պես։ Աբերակ ամեն կողմ։ Փամը չխնայված։ Բոլոր եկեղեցիները, բոլոր դպրոցները եւ բոլոր բնակարանները անձեր ու խանցված քարի գույներով վերածված են, որոնց մեջ են աստին անտին շենքեր կոմախներ գցեցվին։ Արևելքեն մինչև արևմուտք, հյուսիսեն մինչև հարավ, մինչև հեռավոր սահմանները թուրք թաղերուն, աններով եւ թաժանավելությունը հրթիռեր ու փճացուցեր է ամեն բան։ Ու այս մերելային ամայության, այս ընդարձակածավար մոխրագույներում մեջ են երկու մինարեներ աներս մնացած կգանքին խորհրդության։ Արինոտ եւ արցունքոտ ցնցոտիներով ծածկված այրիներու որբերու եւ ձերերու ամփոխ մը ներկայանա մեզի իբրև մնացորդ ադանայի բնակչության։ Մեծ փոթորիկել ետ խաղացած ծովում ռայլ հանդարտություն ունիանիրա։ Իր խորքերու մեջ ծածկված է ցավը ու անմխիթարելի վիշտը, ու այդ ցավը երբեմն մագերեսը բարձրանում։ Ապրելու, վերածնելու հույսը սպանված է իրենց մեջ։ Եվ եթե անօթությունն ու ծարավը չզարթնեցներ իրեն այդ ընթարմացում են, յանքը մի անգամ միշտ մարած կբարակթեն։ Արդարև գարելի չէ ընտրնել ևս կալ, մեկ անգամ են, ահավոր իրականությունը։ Անիկա մարդկային երևակայության սահմանին դուրս կնան, անոնք խորապրած են զայն չեն կարող նաև պատմել իր ամբողջության մեջ։ Ամենքն անգթոթովեն, կհարաչեն, գարդասվեն ու կծկդուր եղելություններ կներկայացնեն միան։ Հուսահատությունն ու սարսափը այնքան մեծ եղած էր, որ մայրերը իրենց զավակները չէին ճանչնար, անդամանուց երկու բարակներ մորցվեցան հրթիռվածությունների մեջ։ Բայրակ եւ արմի ծարավի խուժանի մթիվային քրքիչները դիգելով մարդիկ ներդերի առաջ կխելակարվեին։ Կդրտված անդամներ ու դողումարիններ թեր ցավով ու կյանքով փապախուն ոտքերու տակ կջզվեին։ Մեկ կողմի հարացանի, մյուս կողմի գրագի մեջ փրկված դպրոցներն ու եկեղեցիները, աբսրանող խելագորույս տղաքը, գիններն ու վիրավորները իրանում փակցված գացխանային։ Ոչ այս պատմությունները սակայն, ոչ այդ մոխիրներու մեջ խլելով դարտահայությունը, ոչ ցավոտ եւ շվարուն աչքերով ու սարսափի արպեցութենեն թեր չստապած երևույթով որբերը, ոչ անմխիթարելի գորուստով քարված մարմինները այրիներուն, ոչ թեր արյունոտ եւ ցավակին վերքերը անդամահատվածներուն չեն կարող մեզի պատկերացնել դան իր իսկական մռայլ մեծությամբ ինչ որ պատահած է այդ դժոխային օրերու մեջ։ Անցկալի ու արհավրալից աչքերու մեջ է որ երբեմն մեկ րոպե կգացեն ընդդժմարել զայն։ Օհ, այդ աչքերը, գրանվորվորացած և հրաժարած գտերմի ընդմիշտ արելի վրապուտենեն ու անհատակ վիհիմը պես բարակ գերվին։ Գանորգնային քեզի չեն լեսներ, որովհետև անչնչելի էր, որ մեր պատկեր թոշված էր ինձ տեսողության սահմանում մեջ։ Գան որ մահաց են քստների փոցերով ռիթմը իրենց նայվածքի մեջ ու գան որ հավաշարժ պիպերով արյունի և կրակի տեսարաններով հաճախում են լանջված պիպերով կարծես գուրնալու և խաղաղության գդեջան։ Ու ինչ-որ անգանքների ու անթարմանելի գտվի այս անսահմանելի աղետի մեջ, մոխրացած տուները կանթված այքիները չեն, ոչ արմերնողներու թիվի մեծությունը, այլ անչլադիչ ներքին սկացումը, որ գծազանի ամենուն աչքերու մեջ ողորմելի օրեն հուսահատորեն։ Եվ այդ, ոտքի դակ կացած պիրտ ներխաններու դակ ճզմված ժողորդի մսկացում է։ Այն կնողները, որ լույսի և ազատության զարավի բախմը պարսրացած էին մարդորեն, չախշախված էին հիմա աններով անկտության մա։ Այս մնացումով դանչված գնային կանթված քաղաքի վրա, որում մոխրագույդերը ահավոր և դարբեր նշանակություն կստանան։ Ու ահավասիկ սակայն այս չարապաստիկ ամրության ու ուսալության մեջ հույսի ժպիտն գծաղվի։ Հավերքներու մեջ ես մտված բավերու շուքի տակ գիներ ապստանած են ու որորանը մեկ պատեն մյուսը ծրված գդադանի մեր մորեն։ Ով գիտե, ինչ-որ մեր ցավի սասկությունը անգարելի գերգացնի, թերևս կարելի մտա ժողովրդի վերածնության անխոնջ շոնքի հագից հանջարին համար, որովհետև այդ թշվար դողանշուկ օրորանը, ընդհանուր ու մեծ թշվախտությանը անդարբեր, յանքի անհաղթելի ծրտումով զորավոր, գդադանի այս հսկարայանը կերեսմանին վրա արհամարհելով թե կետնաքարշ դժվարությունը նախդարված ժողովրդին, թե ջիգավային փրկությունը ոչխակոսն է։
Did you see it? Did you hear it? Did you feel it? I want to thank both our guests here today. The Yessayan books are part of the AWA Treasury of Armenian Women's Literature, this series. And as Maggie said, I do have to commend AWA for bringing to light some of the literature that otherwise would not be read by our future generations, otherwise would not be known by our future generations. These translations of AWA, people like Judith and Danila and Jennifer Mamoukian, who's also worked on some of the translations of the other books, they must be applauded for the work that they do, because this is from the heart, and they bring it back. It's a renaissance of our literary geniuses of the history and our culture. Now, I will have some question and answers, but I am going to say that purchase these books, share them, talk about them, because it is our moral obligation, it is our own duty to actually relive the memories, bring the past to the present, and pass it on to the next generation. So again, thank you very much, and I am going to open it up to, the microphone is available. Anybody who has any questions to our two very well-knowledge, well-versed Yessayan co-editors.
Yeah, he is working that. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question. My name is Tamar, and I'd like to thank you, all three of you, and all of you for this wonderful event. I wanted to contextualize my question within a question of context. And because Ms. Sanya, you wrote that Yessayan was writing this book for everyone at the time, and I wanted to ask, for this younger generation, for whom perhaps it's a moral obligation to read, to bring the past into the present, as co-editors, what would you point to within this particular text for young readers to look to as they read in a completely different community from what is being described? So it's not only a historical look at something, but it's something me as born in America, and I haven't read any ruins yet. I'm just starting to read my great-grandfather Hako Pashaman's work. What do you point to so that I connect in certain ways, since you are so closely rooted in this work, this text?
Thank you for that question, and I'll take a stab at it, and Danila maybe will like to as well. It's a good question, and it's very very thoughtful and provocative. So I guess my initial thoughts are this, that Yessayan was really, as I said, giving voice to these women and to these survivors of the massacres, and she, she captures the spirit of the Armenian soul, their intense desire for freedom, for human rights. She captures that in this book, and and you could feel throughout the book the underlying belief that there was going to be a change. 1908 signaled an important change, and as a result, the Armenians had been hopeful, and even though their hopes had been dashed, there was still a little bit of fire, and you could feel that towards the end of what we were reading, a little bit of, a tiny flame that maybe perhaps, there was a possibility of change. Now, it didn't come then. It didn't come after the massacres of Adana, even though Yessayan had said, look at what's happened here, how the Armenians have been sacrificed. It obviously didn't come in 1915. It was the worst possible calamity, and as a result of the genocide. And to some extent, it still hasn't come in Armenia. And I think that, so when I think of people today, Armenians in America, we have human rights, we have freedom of expression, but many people around the world, and particularly in these two countries that we're so intimately connected with, Turkey and Armenia, and the surrounding region, they do not have human rights. It's so clear in Turkey today that freedom of expression is under assault, and I can talk about that, but I'll try not to go off on that topic. But it's under assault, and academicians are in prison, people who are speaking out against the violence are in prison, people who are talking about the connections with ISIS and the government are in courts right now, on trial. So a lot has to be done, and I think what is important is to recognize that we, living here, can still have a voice in what goes on around the world. And it's hard to say how much we can have an impact in Turkey. I do believe we can have an impact in Armenia. I think it's very important to not only bring Yessayan's works to Armenians in Armenia. Obviously there are people who know her work there, but you can see from the film that she's still a relative unknown, and this is in a country where she dedicated her life, she wrote, she lived her last years, she brought her family there. They still don't know about her, and it's so important in a country where women's rights are, under assault, where there's domestic violence, and where, human rights is an extremely important issue. It would be wonderful if Armenians around the world, could work for Armenia to become a beacon of human rights. And so what I say is, take that great gift we have here and carry that to wherever you can, because we don't live in a bubble, and we do have a responsibility to everyone.
Are there any other questions?
Yes.
Maggie, do we have time? We do? All right, good. Yes.
Thank you very much. Very informative presentation. My question is, now that Stalin is gone, Soviet Armenia is gone, and it was a sad commentary to see in the documentary that seems like no one knows anything about Zabel Yessayan. I wonder what's the current government's, Armenian government's position, opinion about Zabel Yessayan, and also what about the Writers' Union in Armenia?
I just want to say that I think they are interested in Zabel Yessayan. I think they respect Zabel Yessayan a lot because in order to, for instance, the pictures and the letters to her husband, all of this came from Armenia. Which was it the Genocide Museum?
It's the
No.
Museum of Literature and Art,
Yeah.
which is also known as the Charitz Museum.
Yeah, and you can see in the book, all the various documents, all the archives are important archives of Zabel Yessayan are in Armenia. And as you know, recently some official people came from Armenia, and I heard one of them say we should have a conference about Zabel Yessayan. So definitely they do pay attention, and they'll pay more attention now that we're talking about Zabel Yessayan in the diaspora.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that Yessayan is now being translated into several languages, in addition to English and French. It started with the French, in Turkish. And just a week ago in the Boston area, a Turkish woman who's an actress and a playwright came and spoke about her play called Zabel, and it's based on the early years of Zabel Yessayan. She performed it not only in Istanbul with her troupe, there are 6 actors and 3 musicians. They got money from Hrant Dink Foundation to take it to Yerevan. And there was a full house in Yerevan. They only did 2 performances. But it just shows you that, the interest in Yessayan is really burgeoning. She's also been translated into Italian and most recently into Bulgarian. But the Turkish translations are coming very rapidly, one upon the other. So, I mean, this is good, and I think this will increase the interest in Armenia, in Yessayan, as someone who attracts a large audience. But, I think that they probably are not that familiar with her message, but I do hope that it will resonate strongly. I think it's a very significant message.
Yes, and there is a revival. It is because of the human rights and the equal rights movement that is so important to not just the Armenians but everywhere. But yes, there is a revival because, as you heard, Lara Aronian is one of the students, for example, and some of the other students are now becoming more interested in some of these women who actually could say and speak more fiercely about rights and human rights. And it's good to see that it is coming back. And we're saying that, I think what they're pointing out is that we were there. We just need to revive it. So, yes, there is a revival, and I'm glad to hear all the translations. The gentleman in the back, you had questions? Yes, yes.
Since Yessayan was a well-known intellectual in Constantinople at the time, how did she manage to free Constantinople at the time when all intellectuals were being rounded up?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll start, and then Danilo, you might want to add to it. But she was on the list of 250 intellectuals who were targeted for arrest on April 24th, 1915. She wasn't at home. And she was visiting a friend, and her mother was at home, and her son, and her mother got word to her that they were coming to find her. So she went into hiding immediately with a few other Armenian intellectuals who were not caught right away. Most of them, as you know, were arrested that day, and then within several months thereafter, there were additional arrests and deportations and murders. But she was in hiding, we think, for about 3 months, possibly in a hospital where she had a relative. We've actually got we've got access now to her account of this that was published in Bulgaria. So she escaped to Bulgaria under a false identity, and she worked there on behalf of the Armenians and her compatriots who were, her colleagues who were in prison. She went to foreign diplomats, she wrote in the papers, and she immediately published an account of her escape, but she used a pseudonym, so it's a little bit, there has to be some pieces of it that are not true, because she used a male pseudonym. She used the name Viken. And which just shows you her, her flexibility. She was very able to, to do things in order to, to create literature. She didn't always just follow what you would expect. She took unexpected paths.
And I just want to add to that, yes, she signed it. There is an account of her, how she escaped. She signed it, and we found it recently. We found the entire article and written in Armenian, and Julia and I have the intention of reading it because I'm sure there are many more details in there.
Hello. My question is, since you have come to know her so intimately through your translations and your editing, she's been described in many ways as a feminist, some as a great writer, literary writer. What do you think that she would want her legacy to be? How does she see herself? What would she have wanted for people to have seen her as today?
Do you want to go first? Okay. All right. Well, I would say first and foremost, she'd want us to remember her as a writer. At a very young age, probably around 14, she decided she was going to be a writer. And we know that because she writes about it in the Gardens of Silidar. When she and a friend, we think, around 14, 15, go to visit Madame Dussap. So Madame Dussap is the great, well-known writer in Constantinople, the feminist writer. She was not quite as popular at that point, but she was still, highly regarded in the community because she hadn't written for several years. So Yessayan does go and visit Madame Dussap and tells her that she intends to be a writer. So we know from a young age she wanted to be a writer, and I believe that she devoted herself to that. However, because her life was so connected with the great, disaster of the late Ottoman years. She was so closely connected with every terrible event that happened that she had to take on a new role, and that was as witness. And she felt, for at least a certain number of years, certainly after the massacres, during and after the massacres of Adana until 1911, and then during and after the genocide. From 1915 on to at least 1920, her role was to bear witness, and she knew she had to do it, and she was doing it with great intent, and she felt that this had to be done, that these accounts could not be lost, and she was the person who had to save them, and she was writing and publishing, and she wrote, as I said, the first eyewitness account of the genocide that I know of in 1917. It was the account by Haik Toroyan. 1917, he was a survivor, and he came to Baku. So I guess I would say primarily as a writer, certainly as someone who was a champion of human rights. That would be just right there, right behind it.
I would say activist. I would say being a very strong woman. That was very important. It came very naturally to her, and also I think one of her main statements is to work for the common cause, and not just the Armenian common cause, in general. Work, do good, basically. I think that's what she would like to be remembered.
Thank you. I think we're going to wrap it up because there's a lovely exhibition in the Deukmejian, or in the foyer of the Deukmejian Hall, and a reception as well. It's waiting for you. But before I do want to thank, first of all, Maggie Goshen, who is a powerhouse on her own. She actually, please applaud. She holds meeting events, and she does them with the greatest of ease. be with the greatest of ease because she relieves so much of the responsibility from all of us who join in and go jointly in with her. I want to thank Nasser also. You work closely with AWA in Boston, and I'm glad to see you're here too. And also, Dr. Kirumian, I want to thank you for giving that introduction that set the tone for the rest of the afternoon. Thank both Danila and Judith and everybody else. If I missed anybody, thank you very much for being here. Maggie, if there's anything you'd like to add, I really appreciated the audience today. And do go out there and buy those books, read those books, pass them on. And
Can I say
sure.
one quick?
Judith always has the last
I have the
word.
last word.
Sorry about that. I want to thank Deukmejian for agreeing to be the interviewer and moderating today. You did a wonderful job. I really appreciate it.